Dude, thanks for coming here. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, George.
I see you're still sporting the beard.
I am.
You're still doing that?
I am still doing that. Love the beard. Need the beard.
You're looking good. I'm glad that you were able to make it, and I appreciate it.
I'm very happy to be here. Glad to see you again.
We go back a while.
Yep.
Obviously, through your exploits in politics. We were talking just a little bit before we went on air. The difference between the lifestyle and how things change dramatically from being an elected official, and you were a minister, so you had a much busier schedule than the average.
Well, it's a crazy rhythm. Yeah. I mean, you know it. M&As, ministers. Every day you're working, and you have a full schedule. You get up, I used to get up like at 4:30, 5 a.m., depending either Montreal or in Quebec City or wherever else. And, you check the media, you check the different sites, the different papers, TV, radio, what's everybody saying. And the types of portfolios I had environment, I had immigration. Yeah. So those were usually in the media quite regularly. Sure. So there's always something somewhere going on. And you had to prepare for meetings, for files, and you had a full schedule. So you always had something. It's not like you had any downtime. So over 5 years, you develop that rhythm, right? Where, whatever, you're in Saint Michel, meeting with people in your writing, as I was, you were in Park X, or in Quebec City or Montreal, downtown, whatever. Or, in the regions, you're touring the regions, going across Canada, even around the world. Yeah. And you always have one meeting after the other, or you're in the car and you're making phone calls, or you're reading something, or you're preparing for the next thing, or you have question period, or you're meeting media. So you're always on, weekends, holidays, there's always something. And also it's always you, right? It's always you that's in front. It's always your name. It's always about you. And you got social media going on. You've got text messages. You got everything. So you're basically always on fire. There's always something going on. And when that stops really abruptly. It's like one day you're the minister, the next day you're not. Yeah. And that's it. Yeah. You're done. And the phone stops ringing, and you go back to this normal rhythm, because that's what's abnormal. But when you're doing it for 5 years continuously,
it becomes your normalcy.
It becomes normalcy. Yeah. Exactly. But it is totally abnormal. Yeah. But it's like your car, it's like going 160 all the time. And all of a sudden you drop down to 50. Yeah. And
it's 50, like turtle speed.
Exactly. Like what's going on? Yeah. And where you go to, the place I went to is, what's wrong with me? Yeah. What's going on? Yeah. Am I doing something wrong? And the adjustment is really something, because I'd have these days, because, I'm practicing law at Fasken now, and teaching at Concordia, and I'm doing some political analysis on TV and radio. And, I have a pretty full day usually, but sometimes
it doesn't compare to what it was.
Not at all. The rhythm. So I work hard, but it's like, sometimes you'll have a little break, or you'll have some downtime. And I remember at the beginning, like back in the fall of 2018, early 2019, I was like freaking out. Yeah. Like, what am I doing? Why don't I have anything?
Where are all my emails?
Yeah, where are all the emails? Don't I have something to do?
My phone's broken. Nothing's coming in.
Something's wrong. I had 2 phones before. Yeah. Now I only have 1. Yeah. And it's not like, and I haven't had a text message in like an hour. What's wrong? It was crazy. Yeah. It was just it's an adjustment psychologically, physically. I lost 45 pounds.
Yeah. Well, it's a good thing. It's
a good thing, but it just tells you physically, psychologically, spiritually. I mean, it's a big change to go back to normal life.
But it's also the toll that your body, like you mentioned about the weight thing, you're in politics, and you often forget about, your health, right?
Totally.
You're on the go. So you're going to grab just a snack, or, you're not focused on, what am I eating? Am I exercising? Am I meditating, or whatever people are into, and you realize that in the end, you're like, dude, I started politics and I was like, I don't know, whatever weight, and
you're so right.
40 pounds, dude. It's
45. I lost 45 pounds. But I'd realized, so right after, I had the fall. So I decided not to run again, right? So the election was in October. even after the election, you're still a minister till the transition.
Until the new government takes over.
So I was actually still minister until October 17th. And so I transitioned into the new jobs, but I went to a doctor for just a medical checkup in early 2019. And I had to realize that I hadn't been in to see a doctor in over 6 years.
Jesus.
For anything. And it was like, whoa. And so just a checkup. And it was kind of a wake-up call.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're right. Even in that rhythm in politics, you don't even think about what you're going to eat. Mm-hmm. Because there's always something, there's a breakfast meeting and the breakfast is provided. Even you're at a restaurant or you're at a hotel or you're, even within government in Quebec City or at the writing office or whatever, somebody gets you the food their food is provided. So you're not thinking. Mm-hmm. You have events, right? You have events in the writing, you have events, corporate events, chambre de commerce events.
You're going to find conferences. Something to,
So you're always eating. There's always something. There's a lot of alcohol too.
Yeah.
And so to be polite, you're taking a drink or two, but you're realizing that you're basically taking a drink or two almost every night at these events. Exactly. No, but you're not getting drunk. You're not doing anything wrong.
Slowly, it accumulates.
It does. Yeah. And you realize, and you're not exercising. Yeah. You're being driven everywhere. You don't really walk. There's not a lot of time. I used to try to go box in Saint Michel maybe once or twice a week. And that helps, but that wasn't enough, right? Yeah. There was the lifestyle also to go with it. So 2019 was a big wake-up call to really get healthy, not only in the lifestyle, but the way I ate and just be careful.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's go back in the beginning because you didn't just happen to fall from the sky in 2013 when you picked up that nomination in the Viau riding, which essentially is Saint Michel.
Saint Michel.
You were involved politically before.
Yeah, I started off actually when I was 15 years old. Mm-hmm. I started off. I used to go to Brébeuf, and I remember there was at the time. So it was the late 80s. And it gives you an idea how old I am. I'm already an old fogey. But anyways, late 80s, I'm at Brébeuf, and the PQ had like a political committee there. And they would bring personalities, like Jacques Parizeau and, stars of that time in the party. And I realized there was no liberals. Yeah. There was no liberal committee or anything. So I just one night picked up the phone and cold called the Liberal Party headquarters and said, explain them, I'm a student Brébeuf and there's no liberal presence. It was at the time, it was the Bourassa government. Mm-hmm. And I said, but the PQ is very active. So, are you guys doing anything? Can I help? Can I do something? So the very next night I had a meeting at the offices. Back then they were on the Gaspé near Laurier. Mm-hmm. And so I went there and got involved in the Commission Jeunesse, the youth wing of the party. And I got really involved. I became the youth rep for the West Island. I really got involved at the time. I lived in town Mount Royal, so I got involved in the writing association with John Chacha, who was a minister, a great M&A for decades in Mount Royal, and a great minister in the Bourassa government. So great guy too, fascinating guy. And just got involved and did a lot of work up until 1990. And then 1990, something happened that really, for me, politically, really affected me was the failure of the Meech Lake Accord.
Yeah, yeah.
And I remember I was following that, like crazy. And I kind of went through a phase where I just didn't know if federalism was working.
Yeah. And you weren't the only one, for the time.
No. I mean, the
whole Conservative Party back then lost its momentum completely with
Le Beau Risque and everything, and Brian Mulroney and all those negotiations, with Robert Bourassa and Brian Mulroney and everybody and Lucien Bouchard, who was
that's the thing.
Minister.
You have such a big figure splitting from the party and creating the Bloc Québécois and creating this other wave.
With Jean Lapierre, remember?
From the Liberals.
It was crazy. Yeah. And then you had Bélanger Campo. Anyways, I don't want to quote through all the history. But
so
for me,
so that puts you into all this questioning.
and ultimately, I stopped, becoming a liberal, and I ultimately became a sovereignist. And in 1995, I voted yes.
Wow.
Yeah, I did. And I remember how close it was, like 50,000 votes.
Yeah.
It was crazy. And then I was working in I had several jobs, and ultimately from one job to another, I got to 2001. I actually worked for Bernard Landry.
Mm-hmm.
I was a staffer, a political advisor when he became premier in 2001. So I worked for almost a year in his office when he was premier for the first year. And that lasted basically a year, went back to the private sector. I was 28, 29 back then. And then I stopped all political involvement, nothing.
Right.
And for years, I mean, I didn't do anything in active politics. I actually lived in the U.S. for a few years, worked and lived in the U.S., and came back in 2009 and worked at Just for Laughs, then Evenco. Then I became CEO of Montreal's Olympic Park, where the stadium is and everything. And 2013. Charte des Valeurs of the PQ. And that was really, for me, that was something that I found completely, disconcerting and for me, just wrong. And I was seeing what it was doing to our community, not just in Montreal, but, all around Montreal and in Quebec. I mean, the debate and what it was leading to and the type of nationalism it was opening the door to, for me, it was just wrong. And in 2013, at the time, there was Philippe Couillard had became leader of the Liberals, and Pauline Marois was premier, and she was talking a lot about calling elections. She was leading a minority government. So in the fall of 2013, there was a lot of buzz that there might be a general election, but there were already 2 ridings where there would have to be by-elections. There was Outremont and Viau. Yeah. And Philippe Couillard didn't have a seat. And so
because he took over Outremont when he won the leadership.
Actually after. He won the leadership in the spring of 2013.
Yeah, and then he ran in Outremont. Raymond Bachand left that void there. Yeah.
And at the same time, Raymond Bachand had left, Emmanuel Dubourg
he jumped federally
in Viau. Yeah. And he jumped federally to Bourassa, which is Montréal Nord. Yeah. And because Denis Coderre had left his federal seat to become mayor of Montreal. Yeah. So it was like this chain reaction, right? Yeah. And so Viau was available, and I had done a lot of work in the East End with the Olympic Park, and I'd gotten some notoriety about, relaunching the park and, making it more accessible to people, having more events. And that was working. And I was actually approached back then by both the PQ and the Liberals to run. Wow. And I immediately didn't follow up with the PQ, but Philippe Couillard called me up, and his team called me up in 2013 in the fall to discuss me running in Viau. And at the time, the Liberals were in the opposition and were actually behind in the polls. I mean, it wasn't like obvious that the Liberals.
I remember even when the campaign started, we weren't doing so well.
In March of 2014, correct? You're right, and we were like 5-10 points behind in certain polls.
And honestly, it's thanks to Mr. Pelado's
the fist.
The fist in the air that kind of turned things around.
It really because they were galvanized.
They were being very careful about bringing the topic of sovereignty into the elections.
Right.
There was the whole issue of the Charter of Values that became the central campaigning theme. So people were taking their positions, obviously. But when that whole separatist thing exploded, people were like, we're not there yet. And
well, the Liberals were very good, and Philippe Couillard was very good at
bringing it out
and saying, okay, when's the referendum?
Yeah.
So are you going to take us through this again? A third time? Yeah. And what's your schedule? And what are you going to do?
It was a turning point.
It really was. It really was. No, absolutely. Because after that, the momentum started to shift.
Yeah.
And you also saw with the charter, and I saw it, and you saw it too, because we worked together on that campaign. I remember,
but it's also the electorate that we had.
That's it.
We were like not, forget about what was happening at a national level. This whole question of the Charter of Values. We were actually living it.
We were living
the communities in Parc-Ex, Villeray, Saint-Michel.
Saint-Michel, but I would go to mosques and even the turnout. The election was on April 7th, 2014. The turnouts, even though you would say these were traditional liberal ridings, Saint-Michel, for example, and the turnouts were huge.
Yeah.
I mean, you had communities like, the community from the Maghreb, for example, the Communauté Maghrébine. So Moroccan, Tunisian, Algerian, North African communities, which are very strong in Saint-Michel and the surrounding ridings. In previous elections, they maybe 10, 15, 20% of those communities actually come out and vote.
Yeah.
This time around, it was 60, 70%.
It was record numbers.
Huge numbers. And all other communities. I even had, Villeray, which is Villeray itself is more PQ. At the time was more PQ. Now it's Quebec Solidaire mainly, but it was more PQist. I had PQists coming up to me and say, well, for this election, because I disagree with the Charte des Valeurs, I'm going to vote Liberal.
Yeah.
Because we were perceived as the only option to stop it.
Yeah.
And it was important to unite the vote to make sure one party was being able to block it.
That was our election with the highest majority that we got. It was, and we also knew that like from that night when we were looking at the results, we also knew that those numbers were never going to repeat themselves again. It was, and for a riding like ours and probably like yours as well, but I think Laurier-Dorion, which is Parc-Ex Villeray, is a lot more multi-ethnic. It was as if all stars were aligned.
It was
true. Sovereignty issue, Charter of Values, and it was
a perfect storm.
It was a gift from the sky. It was like
I won with I remember, and Viau, had always been a liberal riding and it was strong majorities, but I'd won my by-election with 59-60% of the vote, but low turnout.
Yeah.
And this time you had very high turnout and 62% of the vote.
Yeah.
And, in 2018, my friend Franz Benjamin won Viau with 46% of the vote. And there's other reasons for that, but it just gives you, and Emmanuel Dubois had won with under 50% of the vote. So it really was that a perfect alignment, as you say. And it was a great campaign because I was asked to talk, at mosques and at community groups outside Viau. I mean, it was like there were debates and, I would do debates about Montreal with Denis Coderre and Amir Kadir and Jean-François Lisée. And that was the topic. And it was a great campaign and we won 70 seats out of 125.
Yeah. Did you ever get any heat from going? I didn't know that you were part of the Liberal. It's the first time I heard. I'm hearing it today. I knew that you were an advisor to Bernard Landry, and I was wondering, was there any heat? Because I thought you went from the PQ to the Liberals.
No, I went to the Liberals to the PQ, back to the Liberals.
Any heat came up from that? I mean, did you?
You mean when I came back?
Because there's no way you can really cover anything, right? In politics, all these things are going to come out.
Of course, and no, but I never tried to cover them. And the thing is that for sure when I came back to the Liberal Party, there were some hardcore liberals that gave me a hard time.
Yeah,
I remember a few very tense meetings where I was put through the ringer by some senior officials from the party about, am I really a federalist? And am I really a liberal? And at the same time also, which was funny, is that a lot of PQists, when I announced my candidacy for the Liberals, came out publicly. And, I remember Carole Poirier, who's an M&A in Hochelaga Maisonneuve. I met her in a restaurant and she just didn't say hi to me at all and just yelled at me that I was a traitor.
Come on.
A traitor. And I was like, whoa, okay. But
It's crazy how personal these things can get. Eh?
Very personal, very, very personal. And it's, it gets very emotional very quickly. And, it sort of gets to a point where, you know, it's way too exaggerated, and you have to bring it down a notch. And
you see, I realized that when you know the political thing was finished, and you realize that for all these, because I was there for almost 12 years, you realize that you've been living in a bubble.
Totally.
Because you think everything revolves around what's happening in Quebec
You're
politics.
so right.
And, you know, but, you know, I remember having discussions with my wife and other friends, and they're like, dude, who cares? I'm like, what do you mean, who cares? Don't you see? And I just realized, you know, at the end of 2018, when we came out, let's say, you know, the first couple of months, you're still kind of in that phase. So early 2019, I realized, God, nobody gives a shit. Nobody cares. It's so such a bubble. Like really nobody cares.
It was so funny because I would, you know, when you're especially when you're in power, right? When you're everything, a minister, obviously what the premier says, how commentators react, when they talk about you, when you have a policy, a major announcement, and you're getting ready, and you're so involved. It's all your being. Your personal. It's personal. It's business. There's no personal in business. It's all you. Yeah. And you're always putting everything on the table, all of you, and your staff is super intense. You know, guys, you know, guys like you, you're full on as well. You're fully engaged, you're full throttle, and everybody's at that same level, right? But what I realized after I left politics is, oh my God, people barely hear a 10th or 1/100th of what we do, of what we say. Yeah. And they're not necessarily, and not because they don't want to, it's because they have a life. I mean, you know, they have lives, they have children, they have a job. They're not 100% always listening to TV or radio and following Question Period and, you know, all the ins and outs of politics and the behind the scenes and the commentary. And we used to freak out at whoever would say something negative about us. And when you go back into from politics and you go back into regular life, you realize, oh my God, almost nobody noticed. Yeah. It's like, and for you, when I was in, it was like the end of the world, you know. It's fascinating. But in retrospect, when you realize that nobody really cares, did you put in question like everything that you had done like since 2013 in terms of not necessarily their importance, because of course they were important things, but that all that effort that you gave, the sacrifice that you've made, you know, personally, family wise, you know, whatever. And then you come out at the end and you're like, what is this for? You know what I mean? Well, I get the question. I would put it maybe a different way. What I realized, one of the things I'm realizing, I should say, because I'm not done, you know, analyzing and learning from those years, you know, and we talked about this earlier. You know, it's barely been over a year, and it takes more time than that to fully assess and take account of what we went through in politics, and to come back from it and get back to a normal life and analyze with, you know, rationality what you did and what you did well or not so well, and what lessons to take from it. But I would say that all that effort, I think it's more about how we communicate to the people. I don't think the political class, and it's not just the liberals, it's the entire political system and the political class is disconnected in a lot of ways with people. And that's a big problem. But it's not just in Quebec.
But it's funny that you mentioned, because I think there's a disconnect in both ways.
Sure.
The politicians towards the people, but also the people towards the to the political class.
Sure. Absolutely. I think we're still, there's a lot of assumptions being made, and we're still we're not doing a good enough job to explain how complex and not easy these questions are that we grapple with. I mean, just imagine just running a family. We're seeing the royal family these days going through some stuff, and that's the royals, but all our families, it's not easy. It's not. It's never easy. No. Yeah, having a family and being part of a family is tough.
Of course. And especially if you're away for that long during
exactly. So imagine 8.5 million people. Yeah. It's businesses, it's families, it's services, it's community groups, it's origins, it's religion, there's immigration. I mean, all the issues, health, education, it's huge. And managing these things are tough and they're complex, and we're human beings. Mm-hmm. And I think the political system, both the political side of it and the administration, public administration, has to evolve and adapt to a lot of these new realities we have. We're changing, you know, and we have to be able to communicate better and explain better. Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of the disconnect. So it's not as discouraging. Sometimes there are things, we would work so hard on for years, literally. And you announce it and barely anyone notices. And you're like, wow. But what I realized today is something we did, 2-3 years ago is impacting positively the lives of people.
Yeah.
So, it's kind of a trade-off.
Yeah.
Maybe at the time, not a lot of people noticed and did get a lot of play in the media, and we didn't get a lot of credit for it. But today, tomorrow, several years from now, you're seeing positive consequences of your work. And that's the payoff.
Because, I don't know if it's society or if it's the political class itself that puts the elected officials like on this pedestal, mm-hmm. right? And you have to deliver because it's you're there,
personally. I mean? Yeah.
So how do you change that? How do you, like you were saying, there has to be a better way to communicate to people about the reality of what you do and what you're trying to accomplish, right? And I understand there's a disconnect. How do you bridge that?
Well, I think you're right. We've created this aura around politicians, and there's a mythology around, being, in politics. Yeah. And I think the media also, and we play that game in politics where, we love to bring up someone and then tear that person down and bring that person back up and tear that person down again. Mm-hmm. I went through that. Mm-hmm. When I came into the politics, it was like I was riding really a great wave and I had great press. And then I became environment minister, and the first year was rough. Yeah. It was rough. And I had a hard time that first 12 months. And then I got through it, survived it, and then, finished on a high note environment, then moved to immigration, which was,
it's a whole other headache. Yeah.
It was in a bad place when I took it over in October 2017. But when you look at the polling, when you look at the party, when we finished a year later, we were strong on immigration. And so you go through these cycles, and I think we have to do a better job about showing our humanity and accepting that sometimes, just saying, yeah, I dropped the ball. Mm-hmm. We're so in a mode where we will not concede that we made a mistake, mm-hmm. because of fear of, being attacked in the media, being attacked by opposition, being attacked, by stakeholders or whatever, fear of losing the election or mm-hmm. whatever. But there's so many examples where, and again, I don't want to pick anybody specific, and regardless of the party, if someone, after a bad call had just admitted, this was a mistake, the impact would have been less than what actually went through, and sticking with that bad decision or that bad call.
But the media definitely doesn't help, I find, and it's weird to say that because you contribute now to the media.
Yeah.
But it seems as though the media very rarely looks at the positive and just focuses on the negative. So regardless of what you have to say, it's damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of thing.
Yeah. And I understand, that point of view. But I kind of, and again, you're right. I am a contributor now to several media. I do some political analysis and CBC, CTV, CJD, and I love it. And the idea is that they have guys like me on to, explain how politics works and give something more than just, what the media sees. And we try to give some analysis and help people understand why or how these decisions are made. And I think that's important. But I think it's an easy reflex to just blame the media. I think, if the media provides this, that's because people love it and they want more of that. And that's what sells. And that's what gets eyeballs or ears or, people to watch. But at the same time, I think people are more discerning than that. Look, you're doing this podcast. People that, that watch you, that means they want something else. And people now have that independence. They can have a lot of different sources. Yeah. So they'll watch one thing, they may watch something on TV, then they'll hear some radio and they'll check a podcast or they'll check some websites. And they'll make, they'll make their opinion. They know what I think is that we in politics, we sort of take the public for granted and sort of assume they will react in some way. And sometimes we're very surprised. And we actually, you realize that people, first of all, they don't hear everything we say and they don't follow everything that's being said. And a lot of people, can make the difference and they think about it and they're thoughtful and they take all the information and they make their own judgment. And I think we have to trust that, but we have to make sure we inform them, we give them that information and not take anything for granted.
Because I was having this conversation with one of Justin Trudeau's staffers back in the day where, that whole issue with Raybould happened and, with SNC Lavalin. And I personally think it was a complete communications mess.
Yeah.
And one of his staffers was telling me, listen, it was a big mess. We should have handled it better, but we were up against the wall. If we would have come out and let everything happen as it should have happened perhaps, or the way that Minister Raybould wanted it to happen and risk losing the SNC headquarters, we would have been blamed for putting 4,000 jobs on the line. We took the option of trying to do something about it to save those 4,000 jobs, and they criticized us for interfering. So it was one of those things where we knew that regardless of the position that we would adopt, we would have been trashed either by the opposition or by the news or by media in general. So you're stuck. So,
damned if you do, damned if
exactly.
you don't. Yeah, I get that. And I remember I was doing some commentary during the whole SNC Lavalin thing. And I was saying, that it was poorly handled. But again, you have that example, George, of exactly what I was trying to say earlier, is that it's like the reaction to the event was worse than the actual event.
Exactly.
It wasn't, remember at the end of the SNC Lavalin affair, we were no longer talking about SNC. I remember that the last few weeks of this whole scandal.
It was a soap opera. What's happening with the minister?
It was Jody Wilson-Raybould and Trudeau's leadership capacities and cover up or not, and Jerry Butts, and we were not even talking about the company or what it had done or not done, because at the time it was still alleged. And so it was more the reaction and the perception of a cover up, or maybe some few things, with Wernick, the clerk of the Privy Council, and all these different things, and the testimonies, and that was the story. And so I get what that staffer told you, and if you had been a staffer or I'd been a minister, that's how I would have probably explained it. But that, I think, illustrates what we need to do better in the political class, is that understand that we have to, put the cards on the table and be much more transparent with these types of situations much earlier.
I think the fear of criticism kind of blocks you from actually even thinking.
I agree.
Something like that.
But there you go. The minute you're doing something out of fear, which is one of the top fuels in politics, fear. Yeah. Well, this, we know this, we knew it before going into politics, and we know it out of politics. Doing anything based on fear is a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
yeah,
fear is not a good motivator. And I think that's the problem. We have to get to this different type of place where we're in politics, we're always doing something based on a risk assessment and a risk of losing. And you know what? I think and it's hard to do. And look, I'm not saying I always did that when I was in politics.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pleading guilty already.
Yeah.
So I'm not trying to say I was better than everybody else. But I think we need, if the question is how does politics connect better with people, I think a first step is stopping this ultimate reflex of always doing something based on fear.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about the cabinet that you held as a minister, because more and more today there's issues that are happening, and obviously you've experienced something related to these files. You were a minister of environment, then you became a minister of immigration, and in the last couple of years, or maybe even months, especially with a new government now in place, there's all these things happening, and it's constantly in the news, right? Yeah. We're always talking about environment. We're always talking about immigration. I just want to know a little bit about, take a little bit from you as, someone that had to deal with these files. We're living in amazing times where you have a 14-year-old teenager kind of leading this global movement. Is there theatrics behind it? Is there not? Whatever, people can judge on their own. But the fact that you have youngsters kind of mobilizing for this cause, I mean, it does carry a certain weight. I have a personal problem between, calling yourself an environmentalist and then, being an alarmist, you know what I mean? Which we're seeing more and more. And I don't know if you agree with me, but I'm afraid that the debate is going there, right? There's like this alarm that is sounding now, and everyone is just confused on what is really happening.
I agree with that. There is an emergency. If you're living in Australia right now,
for sure, you're seeing it firsthand.
You're seeing. We're all seeing it firsthand. There is a change. There's something going on, and it's been going on for years. I'm good, thanks. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of different issues there. And yes, I was, environment and climate change minister for 3.5 years in the government. And I went in Paris, and I was there for the Accords. And after that, I went to Marrakesh and, traveled the world, and was there when the Trudeau government set up the carbon tax. I set up the cap and trade system with California and then Ontario, and, the Green Fund and all the ups and downs with that, and the investments in green technology, but and trying to reduce emissions in all sorts of ways. Here's the thing. There was 500,000 people that marched in Montreal, and Greta Thunberg was there, and it was a great event. And I don't doubt for a second that every single person that was there believed in, there needed change, and there was an emergency. But at the same time, in the last federal election, 51% of Quebecers and 67% of Canadians voted for parties that were for Trans Mountain.
Yeah.
Stephen Guilbeault, who was on my back regularly when he was executive director of Equita and when I was minister.
Who, by the way, is one of the more recognized environmentalists in Canada.
He's a superstar. Yeah. I mean, he's Quebec's equivalent of David Suzuki in Canada, in English Canada. And so he was totally against Energy East. And he was on my back for me even suggesting we just study the project, not approve it, just study it. And he now is a minister in a government that's going to do Trans Mountain. Even though he says he's against it, he's a minister. So there's going to have to be cabinet solidarity. And this government has said it's going to go ahead with Trans Mountain. So the idea is that you have to realize that change is not easy. We have an economy and a way of life that is based on hydrocarbons and has been based on hydrocarbons for over a century now. Even, in the studio, my glasses, our clothes. I mean, there's plastics everywhere.
Yeah.
And you can't transition that from one day to the next. It takes time. Some will say that it's not fast enough, and that's their right. And their right to push and to say we should go faster. And that's fine. And the science confirms that we have to go faster if we don't want to lose the type of life we have and the type of environment we have right now. But I remember what Barack Obama said when he came to Montreal a few months ago. He came and gave a speech at Bell Center, and I was there. And he was asked almost exactly the same question that you asked me. And the moderator talked about the 500,000 people who marched with Greta. And Barack Obama, stunned me, because he's considered one of the most environmental presidents the U.S. has ever had.
Yeah.
He signed the Paris Accords that Donald Trump is trying to get the U.S. out of. He's been, recognized as a very pro-environment president, and very respected on those issues. And what he said after, he said, yeah, I respect what she's saying, but at the same time, I can't tell a guy whose family depends on his job in the oil industry and say tomorrow you won't have a job anymore.
You're closing shop. Yeah.
That's it. You can't support your family anymore. And then he gave the example of India. He said, I couldn't tell the Prime Minister of India, who right now has a class, the lower classes. I mean, in India, poverty is like hundreds of millions of people.
Yeah.
It's not a small segment of the Canadian population.
Yeah.
Poverty anywhere is bad. But I mean, when you're trying to pull your country out of poverty, like India, that has 1 billion people, and a majority of them are under what we would consider the poverty line.
Mm-hmm.
And you say, okay, I'm going to give them electricity to help them, to build industry, to build an economy. And you have a superpower or rich countries like Canada saying, oh, well, you know what? It has to be only solar, and it has to be only wind.
Yeah.
You can't use oil, and you can't use gas. Barack Obama said, I can't say that. What I can do, though, is try to help them, develop the clean tech, develop the renewable energies, and give them money, and give them industry, and develop those industries to help them transition out. Just like we need to invest to transition out, so we can help that guy who supports his family because he has a job in the oil industry. Well, if we transition and we help that person, but that's the challenge. We need to do it in a way, because you can't tell a person and make that person feel horribly guilty because that person's supporting his family. And that's the crux right now.
But even as a government, and we're thinking something closer to us like Canada, where we have these natural resources available. We need to get them to market.
Yeah.
And any fiscally minded person would tell you, look, take advantage of them. We need the money that we can reinvest.
Well, even Elizabeth May of the Green Party said so during the federal campaign, that it's better for us in Canada to use our natural resources, so we limit imports, and then work on transition by 2050.
Yeah.
Even the leader of the Green Party said
Do you think it's realistic, the full transition until 2050?
Well, I trust science.
Yeah.
And I mean, now everybody's talking about net zero, and by 2050, we have to get to net zero. Fine. But it's going to be a transition. We have to transition out. And it has to be, in a way that is respectful. Yes, there is an emergency, but you can't from one day to the next just say, okay, you cannot live the way you used to live.
Yeah.
And I think most people want to do the right thing, but they just don't have access to those technologies. And governments are going as fast as they can, but they have a political price to pay. Mm-hmm. Look, again, we had a provincial election on October 1st, 2018. You were there. Yeah. I was there. You ran.
Yeah.
I followed the campaign very closely. I was still a minister, even though I wasn't running. George, honestly, during those 37 days of campaign, was there?
I know the question you're gonna ask.
Yeah. It's your podcast, but I'm asking you the question now.
But it's fine
because I know the answer. Neither the CAC nor the Liberals talked, I think, one day about environment
or
climate change.
Yeah, or at least something concrete.
Concrete.
Yeah.
So so it was not a primary focus of either platforms. And those two parties got 62.5% of the vote.
Yeah.
Think about that.
Yeah.
Quebecers, Quebecers are concerned about the environment. There was a very interesting poll a few weeks before the federal election last October. It was a Léger poll that was across Quebec and across Canada. Huge sampling. Really, I think there was 2,000 or 3,000 sampled. That's a large poll.
Yeah.
And the question was, there was two questions. One, how important for you is the environment and climate change? So obviously that polled super high, like in the 60s and the 70s across Canada. Second question, though, was, so climate change, the issue, how important it is, how will it drive your vote? How is it the driver for your vote in the October federal election? Well, the results of that were stunning. Across Canada, 16% said climate change was going to decide their vote. And in Quebec, just 20.
Yeah.
1 in 5.
Yeah.
So yes, it's important, but I think what's going on right now is that the environmentalists are trying to shame people into evolving. People, they get it, but they want to do the right thing. But at the same time, they want to feed their families. They want to have jobs. They want to give their children a nice future. And, they want to do the right thing, but they're trying to balance out all these different things. And so governments are trying to do the same thing. It's hard to not think about the economy when you're running for re-election.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
And so we have to balance these things out. And I think it's moving in the right direction. Maybe not fast enough, again, as I was saying, for some people, but it is going in the right direction. But you can't shame people into changing.
When you look back in retrospect, everything that was done while you were minister, and maybe even before, because it was still the Liberal Party, except for a short, 18-month period there. You mentioned the environment corridor all the way to California. We had a carbon
cap
market.
And trade system, the carbon market.
Do you think that works? Do you think that was the most efficient thing?
It does. The cap and trade system, even today, I mean, any expert, the Canadian Eco-Fiscal Commission, a lot of experts, independent experts will say that the cap and trade system is more efficient than a carbon tax.
Which is what Justin is doing across. I'm calling him just because we know him, right? We work with him, but Mr. Trudeau.
Yeah, well, the Prime Minister. But the federal government is imposing a carbon tax to any province, well, actually the 4 provinces that have not put in place an emissions reduction scheme system. So the carbon tax doesn't apply in BC because they already have a carbon tax.
And Quebec as well.
Quebec doesn't have a carbon tax because we have the cap and trade system with California. And actually, I had set up with Glenn Murray, who was then the environment minister in Ontario under the Kathleen Wynne government. Ontario joined the Quebec-California cap and trade system. We had done a big ceremony in Quebec City with then California Governor Brown, Jerry Brown. Yeah. Jerry Brown came, and there was Philip Couillard, Kathleen Wynne. We did a big ceremony. And then Doug Ford, when he was elected, scrapped it.
Yeah.
But the thing is that the cap and trade system has generated $4 billion in revenues for the Quebec government, which then is reinvested in emissions reduction strategies. So clean tech, in renewable energy, in public transportation.
So what's the difference between that and what the Trudeau government is doing across Canada?
Well, a tax is different because what the cap and trade system does is that it forces industry to buy sort of emissions permits. And there's an incentive because if you reduce emissions, one, you don't have to pay as much. But also what you can do is that you can sell those carbon credits and trade them and actually make money if you perform well. So it's an incentive for the companies. And also you have an incentive, a built-in incentives to develop clean technologies. The problem with the carbon tax is that for it to be effective, it has to be much higher than what it is right now. It's $10, $20 a ton. The Canadian Ecofiscal Commission has said that by 2030, to be effective, it has to be over $200 a ton.
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, it's not high enough to be a disincentive for companies to stop emitting GHGs. But also what it does is that there's no direct investment caused by that tax in clean tech development or renewables.
Because they're giving back the money straight to the people, right?
To the people. So the revenues, contrary to the cap and trade system, the revenues aren't invested in getting us off fossil fuels.
Right.
And so that's one of the problems with a carbon tax, other than, of course, not being high enough. Whereas a cap and trade system, it's a market system. So the market determines the cost, and it's been going up rarely. When I started the cap and trade system, it was about, I think, $11, $12 a ton, and now it's $17, $18 a ton.
Right.
So it's going up. So it's actually working.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, all those revenues, those $4 billion in revenues the Quebec government has gotten, that's been invested in Quebec to help Quebec companies reduce their footprint, but it's also paying for public transit, for electrification, for a lot of measures that help reduce our footprint.
Is the current government continuing on that path, or are they backpedaling?
No, I'll give them that. The current government has maintained the cap and trade system, and they're working on a plan, the 2030 plan. They've changed the name, but it's going to be based on electrification and reducing our footprint. And they've maintained the targets that we had put in place. They maintained the 2020 target, the 2030 target, and the 2050 target we put in place. So they've respected the same target. They want to respect the same targets. So, and they have the cap and trade system in place. So they are maintaining what we put in place.
All right. Do you think it's fair that they're called, obviously the opposition is doing their job, right? I mean, whether it's the Liberals or especially the Quebec Solidaire, which have taken kind of that image of, the environment friendly party, calling out the government as the anti-environment or...
Well, anybody that doesn't do everything that Quebec Solidaire does, they're anti-life. They're anti-human. No, but there's no middle ground with Quebec Solidaire, and that's a bit too bad there. But again, I'm not. I disagree with the CAQ on a lot of things. Mainly the way now they've transformed the way the Green Fund is going to be managed, and there's not going to be any oversight that I had put in place. To make sure that the money goes to the projects that reduce the most emissions, and there's no longer any direct oversight on how the money's spent. But at the same time, the thing is that when you're governing, and you saw it when you were in staff, and I had to see it as well. Governing is compromise. When you're in the opposition and you have little chance of forming government, it's easy to say
whatever you want,
to say these very wide-ranging, encompassing statements, but when you're governing, especially in the environment, when I was environment minister, I had to deal with all the different cities and towns. We have 1,100 cities and towns across Quebec. Small ones, big ones, regionals, Quebec City, Montreal, CMM. So you have all of that. Then you have all the environmental groups. You have the ones everybody knows, but you have also the ones in the regions, and all the very strong, and they're in the media and they're very present. So you have to deal with that.
And then the lobby groups.
And then you have all the economic lobby groups.
Yeah.
And those are big too. And they have a voice, and they're involved in the regions. And all the M&As. When you're a minister, you can't, and that's what a lot of people, think, well, ministers have a lot of power. Well,
you got to consider the reality that your colleague is going
That's
through.
Right.
Yeah.
So when M&As in our caucus, some of the 69 others M&As would tell me, well, David, what you're planning to do is going to hurt my region because so-and-so industry, which employs hundreds of people and supports hundreds of families in my riding, is going to be hurt by what you're going to do.
Yeah.
What do you answer that?
Yeah.
You say tough?
Yeah.
No, you have to take it in consideration. And so I remember when I was the deposit system, with the glass bottles and the plastic bottles, I had a project, and it seems now the CAT government is going to push it through, which is basically what we tried to do in 2014, 15, and 16 was, include the wine bottles, include the water bottles, and which, there are 240 million wine bottles every year. 60-70% of them don't get recycled. Plastic bottles, 1 billion plastic bottles a year. Again, majority of which don't get recycled. It's a problem. And you talk about climate change. Why is it so hard? Well, because you have bottlers and people in those industries that, are well established in different regions. You have the grocery stores, who, don't want to be stuck with all those bottles coming back. The SAQ was against it when I was a minister. So you have to deal with all of that, and you have to deal with those MNAs who have to be reelected and come and tell me, well, look, David, I mean, what you're trying to do is going to hurt me because it's going to hurt businesses in my riding. And these people will support the other guy in the next election. And I'm going to lose if you do this.
Yeah.
And so in caucus, it's very hard, and you have to balance these things out. Sometimes you go ahead and the premier supports you and you have to go ahead because it's the right thing to do. But sometimes you have to, give and take. Yeah. And it's hard, especially in environmental matters.
Let's talk about the other hot topic, which is immigration. And the current government essentially got elected, I think, primarily because of their stance on immigration. You were the immigration minister. Give me your insight or point of view on Bill 9, Bill 21, stuff that have completely changed, at least the way I got to see Quebec, right? Montreal especially.
Well, first of all, what you have to realize is that the current government was elected with 37.5% of the vote. In the history of Quebec, that's the lowest percentage of the vote a majority government has ever had.
Yeah.
So they were elected partly on that, and that base, was preoccupied with immigration.
But it's far from making unanimity.
That's right.
Yeah.
So first of all, I mean, you have to realize, and we saw it last fall, what they did, in immigration matters, the way they handled the file, and their popularity actually went down.
Complete mess. Yeah.
And so, and it went down to about the levels, on which they were elected, about 38%. And the rest of the vote was split. The PQ got a bit of the vote. Liberals got 25% of the vote.
Quebec Solidaire got a little boost,
15 or 17%. PQ 15, Quebec Solidaire 17, and we got 25. So the electorate was very split, and it didn't all vote for one issue. So we have to be careful about saying that Quebecers, francophones, or even in regions, all support,
because that's the perception that the government is trying to.
But we also had a premier saying, "Well, I look at my Facebook page," and so you have to be careful about who supports what, and not jump to conclusions on how Quebecers feel, because again, look at the federal election. Just another example. I said it earlier. Everybody was saying, "Oh, Quebec, environment." But 51% of Quebecers voted for parties that supported Trans Mountain. So you have to to understand that.
But as a former immigration minister, I mean, how do you see this?
Well, I see this as, obviously, and I've said this before, this is a problem. This is not sending the right message to the Anglophone community. I mean, this whole thing with historic Anglos and it's kind of creating classes of Quebecers. And we're all Quebecers, all equal. I mean, and I'm the son of an immigrant.
So am I. Yeah.
And I don't feel I'm a less or more of a Quebecer than.
And you shouldn't.
Than my mom, whose family has been here since the 16th century.
Yeah.
Or the 17th. I don't remember. And so you can't create these classes of Quebecers. On the immigration side, you can't also, based on some, antiquated, I think, and just really useless form of nationalism, try to divide certain groups of immigrants. And also, what I think is thoroughly short-sighted here is the fact that we actually need more immigration.
Yeah.
It's not only a social and moral issue,
It's an economic
which
issue.
it is.
Yeah.
It's an economic issue. And the fact is that if we want to maintain this Quebec model that we've developed, our social services, we need to make sure we have an economy that can sustain and generate the taxes and the revenues that can pay for healthcare system, that can pay for kindergarten, that can pay for education. And so right now, this is very troubling. It sends a horrible message to our immigrant communities that are here, on your immigrants. And it's not what Quebec and Canada were built on. This used to be a place where, tolerance and, your origins weren't supposed to be a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And tolerance was key, and you were welcome. And there was already a separation of church and state. I was in government. I never saw religion play a role in any government issue. And I actually was in M&A where there was Le Petit Maghreb, and I had in my writing mosques, and I had, Catholic churches and Protestant Haitian churches. And, I had over 60, 70 cultural communities in my writing, just like you did in Park X.
We had 1.3 kilometer radius, Catholic churches, Orthodox churches, mosques, Sikh temples, Tamil temples,
and everybody got along.
Yeah,
and there was no issue, and it was just this fear mongering in the regions that convinced a certain section of the population, and because the way our electoral map works and the division of the vote, and the fact that, let's face it, the PLQ didn't do a very good job during that campaign, and it was 15 years of power, and there was fatigue also. I think the electorate was tired of seeing the Liberals in power, but it wasn't a great campaign either. But the thing is that I think what's happening right now, Bill 9, Bill 21, these are mistakes. And first of all, it sends a horrible message to Quebecers. And especially when you go in the younger generations, because when you go in the schools, which are very diverse, and the kids, they don't care.
Mm-hmm.
They don't care about these issues.
Yeah.
This is mainly a baby boomer issue, I think.
But it's funny that you're bringing it to those lines, because do you at all think that Legault is just feeding into his electorate and saying, look, this is what works. This is where our vote is. This is,
he's talking to his base. He's talking to his base, and his base is older nationalists in the regions.
Do you think that there's a danger of more, I don't want to say extremist nationalism, but more, hardcore nationalism being raised in Quebec, especially in the regions? Will it impact the political landscape? I
don't think, I don't see hardcore nationalism, because I remember when I was minister, I would see episodes, and we saw the rise of La Meute, and groups like that. And look, today we're not seeing them. I don't think Quebecers have the taste for that and want that. Just look again what the CQ government went through with immigration when they went after the students and the foreign students.
Yeah.
And you had foreign students crying and broken lives, and the people reacted. The media, the mainstream French media, the people reacted and said, "Wait a minute, that's not who we are. Stop it."
Mm-hmm.
And the government had to backtrack. It really did.
Yeah.
And it's going to have to do the same thing on labor shortage issues. It's no choice. Companies are actually, losing contracts or have to, refuse growth opportunities because they don't have the labor. And we're in a competition with other territories around the world. It's not like we're the only ones.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to show, and it's a competition issue about attracting the talent to come here. And so I think from an economic perspective, this is going to have to change, but also the type of message we're sending out is wrong, and we have to change it. And we bring it back to a place where, our real Quebec values, which are tolerance, which is inclusion, which is celebrating diversity, is one of our strengths. And I think this base ultimately is not going to grow very much or become a trend, but we have to denounce it.
Mm-hmm. We're going to close it up, but just your thoughts. Leadership campaign, conservative, federal conservatives. I don't know if you want to talk about it provincially. Jean Charest coming back. You didn't live the era with Jean Charest. I did at the Liberal Party of Quebec. But how do you think that's all going to play out at the federal stage?
Well, I mean, right now at the federal stage, I think there's a real sort of a civil war brewing within the Conservative Party. There's this reformist Canadian alliance.
It's also resurfacing, right?
Western alienation, social conservative elements, which actually put Andrew Scheer head of the party last time around. But against this realization that, that message doesn't work in Ontario and it doesn't work in Quebec. And like it or not, in Canada, electoral math is how it is. And if you want to form a government in Canada, you either need a bunch of seats in Ontario or a bunch of seats in Quebec or a bit in both.
Yeah.
You can't have nothing or almost nothing in both. Stephen Harper formed a government with 5 seats in Quebec, but he had a ton of seats in Ontario.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So you can't not win if you don't have a strong combination of seats coming from Quebec and Ontario. And so I think a lot of people in the Conservative Party are realizing that you need to evolve the message and the person carrying that message. And so that's why I think if Jean Charest decides to run, a lot of people are saying he is running, but it's not formally announced yet. He has a shot. He definitely has a shot because he has a great network across Canada.
Yeah.
He's known. He's a known commodity, and he's respected. And he was a conservative minister under Brian Mulroney, and that's the tangent. That's the angle that can maybe help him and give him a serious shot.
I have a lot of friends or people that I know in the conservative circles, and they agree with you in that respect, because I've heard that when Scheer was doing his debrief after the election, he got drilled in Quebec. The Quebec caucus just destroyed him. So obviously that comes into question where the eastern provinces are a whole other world. It's another planet compared to the western provinces. But the fact that Jean Charest was part of the progressive conservatives still doesn't ring well in the western provinces.
I understand. And who is going to strike that balance?
The question is, do you want to stick to the ideology, or do you want to win the next election?
There you go. Is there a compromise somewhere? And that's why I'm talking about in terms of maybe a civil war there. Yeah. And that's why a lot of people were looking at Rona Ambrose, who seems to be able, when she was interim leader after Stephen Harper left, she seemed to have that capacity to bridge those two worlds, but apparently she may not run. But there aren't a lot of people who can bridge those two worlds. And so can Charest do it? Maybe. But we'll have to see. But the thing is that I understand that, the whole Western reformist, but Harper was able to do that, actually. He was able to convince Ontarians, not many Quebecers, but he did do a decent job. He got 10, 15 seats last time, back in 2015. in Quebec.
Mhm.
And he got, a lot of seats in Ontario. And he formed 3 governments. So he was able to create that combination with enough Ontario and Quebec seats to form a government. So what is that? But he didn't have as much of a hardcore message on social issues like abortion or gay rights than Andrew Scheer had. And, Scheer had a lot of trouble with those issues.
It's weird because when you look back at that campaign, for me, because I saw it from, an objective point of view,
Sure.
now, right? I wasn't involved in politics, and I was running the show actually, and I was, I had candidates from all parties. It for me, just from a communications perspective, because that's what I did for the last 11, 12 years, and I was in politics. It seemed incredible for me to think, how could you not have been better briefed to go into this campaign?
Exactly.
I mean, these issues have been there all along.
Yeah. And they're settled. I mean, it's not like abortion is a raging debate in Quebec, Ontario, or Canada. It's settled. I mean, the Supreme Court has ruled, and with everything, it's settled law.
And 2018 started on such a bad note for the Liberals, and it dragged on all the way until the summer. It was
even during the campaign.
And during the campaign, but it was such a spring these guys take advantage of and really do well, and they just didn't.
But right off the starting blocks, you had Sylvie Fréchette saying one thing on immigration, then Alain Reyes saying another, and then Andrew Scheer waiting 3 days to come up, and the French debate where he just completely dropped the ball, and the same thing about gay rights, and not going to Pride, being the only leader not going to a Pride parade. What is that all about? I mean, this is settled. You're in politics, you go to Pride. I went to Pride. Everybody goes to Pride. And it's you celebrate that diversity, and you celebrate the LGBTQ community, and you do that, and you have fun with it. And it's they're part of what Canada is and what makes Canada great, especially like in places like Quebec, Montreal, Toronto, where these parades are, iconic. And so I just don't get it. And people have the right to their personal views, but when you're the leader of a major Canadian political party, which aspires to be prime minister of all Canadians, these issues,
you have no choice. You almost have no choice.
You cannot, these are settled issues. And it doesn't mean there's still, a woman's right to choose always has to be, defended, and gay rights, there's still a lot of work to do. But still, I mean, these, Canada is overall a progressive nation. And we need to move in that direction.
Do you think he's going to survive past 18 months to 2 years? Do you think he's going to make it to 3.5?
Well, it's possible because, look, I mean, right now you don't see the NDP forcing an election, and the Conservatives, I mean, that new leader is, first of all, whoever he or she is going to have to bring the whole party together. Whoever that person is going to have to spend a lot of time uniting this party and building support in Quebec and Ontario, regardless where that person is from. Or maintaining the West and working with people like Jason Kenney and Doug Ford and people like that. And so that's going to take a lot of time. And so the only question is the economy. Right now, the economy is still doing very well. But as you know, a lot of people are saying, a lot of experts are saying, well, maybe this, 2020 and 2021, these will be the years where finally, this long cycle of economic growth will end. And so that could be the only thing that forces maybe an election sooner than later. But I mean, 157 seats is a strong minority, and it's hard to bring down.
Do you feel comfortable at all talking about the provincial Liberals?
Sure.
What do you see? What do you hear? Is there any interest? Is it kind of?
I don't see a lot of interest. I mean, I don't sense it. And to be fair, I mean, and full disclosure, I'm not involved in anything, and I haven't been involved in the party since I left politics. But there doesn't seem to be a lot of energy around this race. And especially since I think the Liberal Party needs to first, redefine itself as a party. This is one of those times in its history where, we're at the end of a cycle, where the Liberal Party is at the end of this federalist versus sovereignist cycle, which defined the Quebec Liberal Party since basically the 70s, and that was what the Liberal brand was in Quebec. It was, we are the Federalist Party. And so if you're against Quebec sovereignty,
we're the option.
Yeah. And regardless of where you were on the political spectrum, that was the first question. And so you were liberal because you were a federalist. And if you were a sovereignist, regardless where you were on the political spectrum, well, you were at the PQ, right? And now this is blown up. And so right now, I think there's some room in the political spectrum. And the Liberal Party throughout its history has had to do this every, 30, 40, 50 years. But the Liberal Party needs to redefine itself now. So you have this right-wing party, center right or right, whatever you want to say it, but which is the CAQ, and a regional-based party. And you have a far left party, which is Quebec Solidaire. There's room there, and this is this room in the political spectrum. And I think that's where the Liberals need to define a message. And it's part of that message is going to be going back, I think, to the old Robert Bourassa brand of liberalism, where you had part of it, you have economic development, but for social progress. And it's simple to say, but you have to define it and present it in a palatable way. But you have to rebuild that big tent, because you have to bring back Anglos, because Anglos don't feel the love right now from the Liberals. Don't feel that Liberals are doing enough to represent. Same thing with the cultural communities, immigrants, people from recent immigration. We have to rebuild those bridges as well. And we have to, and right now I don't feel, a lot of people talk about this seem to have this obsession with regions and the francophones in the regions. And we have, and some messages seem to be like CAQ light. And I'm afraid of that.
I was just about to tell you what I was afraid of, and the fact that we're diverting away from the values that has made that party what it was for all these decades, towards some ideology that made another party succeed, right?
Yeah.
And I think that has to be avoided at all costs. From what I've seen, and it's still very recent, right? I mean, the election was only in 2018. A lot of people still haven't gotten over the fact that we lost.
No, I know.
And you're trying to send the message that, look, dude, you're in politics. It's part of the deal.
Yeah.
You're going to win and you're going to lose. And you got to, if you lose, you got to.
You're not owed anything. It's not an entitlement.
That's what it is. It happens. So pick it up and do better next time. But I'm just afraid that next time is so much more based this time around on what the others did rather than what we have to do.
Right.
And that scares me too.
I think right now, choosing a leader, and we can't do that over, but I think that was premature. I mean, I think the first step would have been to maybe do a convention on who we were and what we are as a party. And then moving from that, then you do a leadership convention.
I agree with you. I think that it's way too soon. And, the party asked the different associations to present a resolution on the date that they wanted the election. I think our association was one of the few that actually wanted the election to be held later than sooner. I of course, we're all Democrats. I mean, people voted and it's fine. We're going to have it. It's going to be held this April, I think, or May. I still think it's too soon.
It seems to be soon, but the thing is, you see it. I mean, there's not a lot of energy on the ground. You don't sense that.
Well, just from a strategic point of view, I mean, we launched a leadership campaign at a time where the government was still in its honeymoon period.
Right.
There's always a year or so that the government is on a high, right? Yeah. And before you know it, we're launching ourselves in a leadership campaign.
And then that leader is going to be in place for 2 years. So you won't have, by the time we have the election in 2022, we won't have that new factor. People will, know this person. There won't be this type of momentum. But we'll see. We'll see.
The argument is that let's do let's have the race done sooner, get that leader in place in order to build.
Yeah, I know. I understand
Is
the
it
argument.
the right strategy? I don't know. Personally, I don't think so. I have nothing against the candidates. I think, Dominique is a great person. Alexandre Cusson, for now, he's not very much known. But in any case, in any of the two scenarios, it's just not picking up.
It's not. It's really, you don't sense there's a strong message. You don't sense that there's a lot of energy in either campaign. Again, I agree with you. I mean, these two people have great qualities, but it doesn't seem to be generating a lot of excitement, and there doesn't seem to be this, this platform that really is distinguishing itself and, drawing people and bringing people that left the party back. You're not sensing that.
Yeah. If you were still in place, what would your message be? What would you be?
Goodness. That's, if I were in politics, I would say that's a hypothetical.
The standard line.
I mean, I think we just have to. I mean, I'm not gonna put myself in a place. There's a lot of good men and women that are currently in the party. We have great M&As that do a lot of hard work, but I think there's this period where we have to really stop and take stock and ask a lot of questions. I'm not going to say I have all the answers, but I think we need to really work hard on finding ourselves.
Yeah.
Just like, we were talking about this, after politics, it's you have to take a step back and you have to take a hard look at yourself and what is good, what is solid, but what needs improvement. And you have to work on those things. And I think that's where we are right now. I think there's a lot of great people there. I think there's a decent foundation and it can come back. But I think right now the Liberals haven't been able to find themselves yet. I don't think they've taken stock and done a lot of introspection, and there still seems to be a lot of clans within the party. And I keep remembering about, Robert Bourassa used to say, you have to add, il faut additionner. And we don't seem to be doing that.
Yeah. The times have certainly changed also, right?
Absolutely.
I remember when we started, there was this enthusiasm. Membership wasn't that difficult, or at least, we didn't think it was difficult. Raising money wasn't difficult.
Yeah, but that's evolved. That's changed. That's all changed. And I mean, even the Liberal Party of Canada, it's sympathizers and, financing is different. People have changed. And politics has changed, and we have to recognize that, and we have to connect with newer generations that we're not connected to at all. I mean, and we have to do a better job with younger voters. And
it's interesting that you're saying that, because during the federal election, I did the car ride segment, and I was talking with a lot of candidates and a lot of their teams and everything. So there was this message from the ground that I was getting from all these different electoral offices, and they were all concerned with the 18 to 35 demographic, and they were often questioning themselves on where they're situated and should we be taking them for granted, and especially with regards to the cultural communities, where we are living at a time where those generations, 10, 15 years ago, they weren't even voting, and now they are, but not necessarily following into their, in their parents' footsteps.
Exactly.
Like, a dad or a mom that would vote Liberal in the 80s and 90s, chances are that your kid today that is eligible to vote may not, but
also even vote at all,
or vote at all.
You have to get them out.
But that's a whole other issue.
No, but that's what we have to work on. That's what the party needs to work on.
Dude, I know you're busy, and I've taken way too much of your time.
My pleasure.
thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it.
Great pleasure, George.
And
good to be with you.
For sure, I'll see you around.
Of course.